Well, I feel very humbled by that very generous introduction. Thank you very much, Ms. Chandani. President Manji, thank you for the warm welcome. I want to acknowledge you for your presence here. Thank you for making the trip. Also, President Alibai of the Ismaili Council for British Columbia for this really marvelous and truly humbling opportunity to speak in this beautiful place to such a distinguished audience about subjects that matter so much to our world. The Honorable Naomi Yamamoto, Minister of Advanced Education, the Honorable Harry Bloy, Minister of State, thank you for your presence today. Former Premier Harcourt, thank you for being here. Community leaders, colleagues, friends. I'm privileged, I think, and deeply honored to deliver this inaugural address in the Ismaili Lecture series. UBC's relationship with the Ismaili community dates back many, many years, and our connections speak to our shared values, shared concerns, and, I think, complementary strengths. Khalil Sharif, CEO of the Aga Khan Foundation of Canada, is a graduate of UBC. Firoz Razul, a former member of UBC's Board of Governors, president of Aga Khan University. His wife Saida, working with UBC professors to establish a global health program in Kenya. Shamiz Mohammed, responsible for building the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto and the Global Centre for Pluralism in Ottawa, sits on UBC's Museum of Anthropology External Advisory Board. The Aga Khan Development Network works closely with UBC's Human Early Learning Partnership, and UBC's former head of pediatrics, Dr. Robert Armstrong, recently became the founding dean of AKU's Medical College in East Africa. So on behalf of UBC, I am so grateful for the strength of our friendship and for today's honor. I've been asked to address the question of the role of universities in developing human potential. The topic is almost limitless in scope, yet I realized that if I did nothing more today than describe to you the reciprocal sharing of knowledge, research, and personnel between our communities, joint development work and program delivery, immeasurable generosity, money, expertise, and ideas across cultures, across borders, side by side, day after day, for years, I would in large measure have answered the question. But I am a professor, used to 50-minute lecture slots, and so I will say a little bit more. Pluralism and pragmatism are the twin lenses I've chosen to focus on the question of the role of universities in developing human potential. His Highness the Aga Khan has been tireless in recent years in promoting the cause of pluralism in speeches and in his most recent book. He's inspired audiences of all ages, races, and cultures to discuss and debate pluralism and to develop their capacity for it. He has just as passionately articulated the need for action. He is, I think, a pragmatist for whom faith is not simply a set of beliefs, but a way of living one's life. And the community he leads lives out this idea, not just among themselves, but within the wider societies of which they're all citizens throughout the world. The spiritual tradition in which I was raised agrees that faith without works is dead. And the secular institution that I lead avows that teaching, learning, and research occurring under our auspices is done in service to the people of British Columbia, Canada, and the world. So I'll speak today about pluralism and pragmatism within the context of the role of the university. But first, what is that role? Instead of an answer, I'll give you a story. In it, a UBC alumna looks back on her first year at UBC. Here is her story. I was a white middle-class Catholic girl First communion at 6, confirmed at 12, and convinced I was to become a missionary by the time I was 18. I'd heard about millions of people who worshipped false gods and who would never get to heaven unless they converted. And I couldn't see the point of 4 more years of school when my powers of persuasion were clearly needed elsewhere. My mom listened to my plans without comment, but then secretly called and talked to my history teacher, a man I greatly respected, and he took me aside one day after class and convinced me that a little more education might make me that much more capable of saving the world. I discovered that UBC had a religious studies department, which intrigued me. So I registered there and signed up for their 100-level entry course, A Survey of World Religions. I figured maybe it would give me more insight into the people I'd be meeting so that it would be easier to convert them. That first September day in a packed lecture hall, a Dr. Charles Anderson took the podium. He was tall and thin, with a kind, intelligent face and a slight Southern American accent. And he began to speak about Hinduism. What struck me was that he didn't speak about it from within the context of Christianity, nor did he compare it to Christianity. He didn't compare it to anything for that matter. He spoke about its origins and history, literature, central tenets, and practitioners, belonging to a complex ancient tradition sufficient unto itself. In that hour, although I didn't realize it yet, something I had thought was solid in me, something I built my sense of reality and identity on, started to give way. I didn't sleep that night. After Hinduism, Dr. Anderson spoke about Buddhism, and more of my formerly solid self gave way. Jainism, Zoroastrianism, Judaism, Islam. I listened, and what I heard I recognized as true. I read, and what I read gave evidence of being sacred. In that year, much of what had been assembled in me in the previous 18 broke apart. I came close to quitting university because of how difficult that process was. But in the end, I chose to major in religious studies. I've spent all the years since then reassembling myself, choosing deliberately the pieces I'm willing to call me, and always leaving room for ideas and experiences still to come. I traveled after I graduated and attended a Catholic Mass at the Vatican. The service and the singing and prayers were in Italian, but I understood it all. And I understood that in some sense, this would always be part of me. 2 weeks later, in Izmir, Turkey, I awoke to the Muslim call of prayer. As I listened, I realized that I understood that too, and that it too was now part of me. Come to prayer. Come to success. The time for the best of deeds has come. The point of non-vocational higher education is to help students realize that they can reshape themselves, that they can rework the socialization of their past into a new self-image, one that they themselves have helped to create. The words of Richard Rorty, one of the leading pragmatist philosophers of our time. His mentor, John Dewey, who's considered the founder of pragmatist philosophy, described, and I quote, the educational process as one of continual reorganizing, reconstructing, and transforming, end quote. I tell parents of new students at UBC, your children will change. A university education is or should be a transformative experience, not only for what they will learn in the classroom, but also for what they discover about themselves, what they encounter in others whose views are different, whose backgrounds are dissimilar from their own, and for what they come to contribute of themselves to to the greater community. I have had to remind myself of those words more than once since my elder daughter went overseas to study roughly 3 years ago. John Dewey was telling us 100 years ago that we must stop, and I quote, thinking of education as pouring knowledge into a mental and moral hole, end quote. And yet there are still educators and institutions, and sadly parents, who operate from the view of the young person as an empty vessel. The real measure of the value of education, Dewey said, and I quote, is the extent in which it creates a desire for continued growth and supplies means for making that desire effective, in fact, and I end quote. Dewey declared that a human being's capacity for learning, and therefore for growth, was dependent on retaining a quality of childlikeness. He used the word immaturity in a positive sense to denote plasticity, the power of potential, sympathetic curiosity, unbiased responsiveness, openness of mind, instinctive mobility, eagerness for variety, and a love of new stimuli and new developments. The human being acquires a habit of learning, he said. She learns to learn. Habits give a person, and I quote, the power to retain from one experience something that may be used in coping with the challenges of a later situation, end quote. The application of intelligence to habit fixes the relation of the habit to varied and elastic use, and hence to continued growth. We learn to learn, and learning becomes a habit, our instinctual response to the new, the unfamiliar, the uncomfortable. If we remain in the habit of learning, then we grow. Our self-concept literally expands in order to accept and integrate what before was separate, foreign, even frightening. If we're not in that habit, then we can stay small, and what seems foreign and frightening remains so, remains separate and incomprehensible. So, we encourage our students through an application of intelligence to the habit of learning, to learn and to grow. But how? And what about those individuals who are not our students at a university? Are they not in some measure our responsibility as well? At the heart of UBC's mission are our commitments, equal in import to research, to learning, and to the engagement of the wider community. So when we talk about our role in human potential, we must mean not only the individuals who enter through our gates, but also those who live and move beyond them. How do we fulfill obligations to them? I think that the answer is simple and hard. Pluralism. Another story. A man sits in the dark on the top deck of a very large ship, all of the northern constellations visible above him in the black sky. It's bar night on board, and around him people are laughing and singing, but the man is in a meditative mood, and so he sits at a distance alone. He hears a small, almost imperceptible sound, and he glances down at the drink in his hand, just in time to see the ice cube in it crack apart. Now, that ice cube was chipped off an iceberg earlier in the day. It's releasing molecules that have been locked inside a glacier since before modern man appeared on Earth. The man in my story is Michael Byers, Canada Research Chair in Global Politics and International Law at UBC. He's the author of Who Owns the Arctic? At the time of the story, he's situated on Pond Inlet, at the northern end of Baffin Island in the Arctic, and he's traveling aboard the Canadian Coast Guard ship Amundsen. The Amundsen is an icebreaker, a ship built especially for breaking passage through icebound waters. And Professor Byers and his fellow passengers are there as members of ArcticNet, a federally funded consortium of researchers from 29 universities. They're there to measure the environment and to search for multi-year ice that survives from year to year. Ice that is melting at the rate 3 times faster than what scientists had predicted. He hears another small sound, and when he glances down again at his drink, the ice cube is gone. As I followed Professor Byers' progress through the Arctic last summer, I thought about how the icebreaker is a metaphor for, or a microcosm of, the university. A place unto itself, but connected to a wider world, a place of study and research that will benefit those outside its confines, a place of collaboration and cohabitation, a safe place for significant conversations about complex issues among people of profound cultural diversity. An icebreaker is a vessel for creating a way forward where before there was none. We use the word as well to describe a joke or a game used to help people who don't know each other to relax and to open up. A third definition of icebreaker is a beginning, a start. A university should be a place where students, staff, faculty, and alumni begin to discover both the common humanity and the deep difference between them, and where it's safe enough to explore the discomfort and the vulnerability inherent in such encounters. It should be a place where open, authentic engagement with people whose appearance or customs or worldviews are different from ours becomes an habitual practice, part of our daily lives. A university campus should offer as many avenues as possible along which the human spirit can fly. Music, medicine, languages, life sciences, architecture, aesthetics, athletics, business, law, land and food, technology, and art. And the library must offer at least as many more. As a student walks down the paths from building to building, class to class, she should begin to notice 3 things. First, that although she may personally only enter 3 or 4 of those buildings each day, there is teaching and learning going on in all of them. What she is learning, what she will have learned at the end of 4 years, is just a tiny fraction of what is available to be learned in that space. Second, that although each building she enters is a separate edifice containing a distinct subject matter within its walls, there's a common denominator, and it is she, herself. All of these different realms of ideas are in fact not separate at all, but interconnected with all of the others, and where they connect is within her. Third, that every person she encounters is similarly a connecting point for an astonishing diversity of ideas and understandings and experiences. And that if she wants to expand exponentially beyond what is available to her in the classroom, what she has to do is to say hello. The 20th century Polish journalist and poet Ryszard Kapuscinski said, and I quote, "Stop. There beside you is another person. Meet him. Meet her. This sort of encounter is the greatest event, the most vital experience of all." End quote. If the icebreaker is a microcosm for the university, then the university is or should be a microcosm of the world. University is meant to be a liminal experience, a threshold between youth and adulthood, between careers, or between stages in life. Time and space outside of ordinary time and space, away from our usual habits and practices, in a place outside our familiar four corners, to investigate who we are in relation to the diversity of experience, custom, culture, and value that we're now encountering, and to imagine who we might yet become. What university leaders must ask ourselves at this juncture in history is whether we are providing that experience as fully as we might. Universities are one of the only social institutions to have survived, both intact and wildly changed, since the medieval era. We've proven ourselves crucial to social, economic, and cultural evolution, and capable of staying relevant and competitive even during times of highly accelerated change, such as we've seen this past century. However, the great crises of our time, from climate change to pandemic disease to pervasive poverty, from the challenges of cultural diversity to the failure of fledgling democracies and a lack of civil society infrastructure in so many parts of the world, these crises persist. And it's my contention that universities around the globe are no longer optimally organized to do what the world needs us to do. Now, I never thought I'd hear myself say, "We need more meetings." In fact, comedian Dave Barry once said, and I quote, "If you had to identify in one word the reason why the human race has not achieved its full potential, that word would be meetings," end quote. But of course, I mean the kind of meetings that Ryszard Kapuscinski spoke of. And so every year, I find myself strengthening the case for increasing out-of-province and international student enrollment. The flow of university students across borders sparks such meetings, and it builds nations. It creates lifelong links between individuals and organizations in every sphere. A study of the 10 highest-ranked universities in the world shows that international students comprise, on average, 21% of their student body, which is higher than UBC's current 18%. What's the connection between international students and a university's place on the world stage? Those students' perspectives, their life experiences, their cultural heritage, their unique ways of seeing and being in the world. Every classroom and dormitory becomes a kind of United Nations, and these informal interactions in group projects, over a shared meal, in a social setting, give both the local and the international students otherwise unattainable insights into global society. International students carry with them their individual gifts and also their extended networks, the family, business, academic, cultural, and social ties that, when shared reciprocally, can help all of us navigate in a complex world. They also contribute to the global increase of knowledge. International graduate students, in particular, bring with them the seeds of current and future research collaboration by tending links among their professors across the global research enterprise. We need more meetings. Currently, UBC enjoys agreements with over 150 other institutions around the world. Student mobility and travel learning opportunities are at an all-time high. However, we have an urgent need to foster greater faculty mobility. But our national systems are not always cooperating. There are still many barriers to international recruitment, such as the impaired transferability of credentials, especially among the professions, and narrow-minded visa rules in many countries. As well, many of our most important funding mechanisms remain inwardly focused, and they fail to foster international collaboration. North American universities are also confronted with sub-national constraints. We're partially, indeed generously funded by state or provincial governments, at least in Canada, and so even recruiting students from a few hundred kilometers away can, for some people, be controversial. But brilliant hiring and recruitment will not of itself create the critical mass of talent that's needed to solve the world's fundamental problems. We need partners. We have to collaborate, not only with other universities, but also with community groups, civil society organizations, industry, and government. And we must do so more successfully than we have done so far. Those of you who run businesses may find it hard to understand that just because presidents and vice-chancellors say they would like something to happen doesn't make it so. Academic freedom is no empty phrase. Truly successful networks and collaborations typically arise in organic fashion from the bottom up. We can't direct this kind of growth hierarchically, but we can, I believe, foster the conditions in which it can happen naturally by lending our support to fledgling successes instead of reinventing the wheel, by encouraging our governments to change rules to allow funding research that crosses borders, by focusing on our strengths instead of trying to be all things to all people, by turning our institutions into communities of practice, and by nurturing global citizens. I'm going to speak more about these ideas of communities of practice and global citizenship in just a few moments, but I can't leave the subject of pluralism without first addressing what I believe to be Canada's and Canadians' greatest challenge in that regard. I mentioned earlier His Highness the Aga Khan's efforts worldwide to nurture a greater understanding and practice of pluralism. His vision will take physical form, as we heard, in the new Global Centre for Pluralism in Ottawa, in partnership with the Government of Canada. The centre will serve the global community as an international think tank on the study, teaching, and practice of pluralism. As well as research, education, and professional development, it will provide resources to developing nations on governance reform and building civil societies. Canada was chosen as the location for the centre primarily because of our reputation as one of the world's most successful pluralistic societies, and also because of the Ismaili immigrant experience in Canada from the early 1970s onward. And I quote, "What the Canadian experience suggests to me," says His Highness, "is that honoring one's own identity need not mean rejecting others," end quote. His Highness is right, and Canadians may rightfully be proud of the successes that led him to choose this country as the home for this visionary enterprise. But I am a professor, and as Richard Rorty puts it, the socially most important provocations will be offered by teachers who make vivid and concrete the failure of the country of which we remain loyal citizens to live up to its own ideals, end quote. I can think of no more vivid, concrete, and current provocation than Attawapiskat. Attawapiskat, as you know, is the First Nations reserve in Northern Ontario that declared a state of emergency this past October, where people are living in shacks with mold on the walls and using plastic buckets for toilets, where in 1979, 30,000 gallons of diesel fuel leaked under the local elementary school, and the school remained in session. Finally closed in 2001 because of continuing health problems suffered by students and teachers, the school still has not been rebuilt, and students sit in temporary portables. And the story continues with floods, sewage overruns, evacuations into short-sighted solutions that become long-term living conditions. Perhaps worst of all, 100 other Attawapiscats exist right here in our home and native land. Now, the situation is partly a legacy of colonization, partly of Canada's residential school system. Aboriginal people in Canada did not have complete rights until 1982, and those living on reserves were not covered by the Canadian Human Rights Act until 2011. Church and state's attempts to civilize and assimilate Aboriginal peoples were in fact a systematic eradication of their identity, their languages, cultures, and communities, through the separation of families, forcible repression, and routine abuse. The last of the Indian residential schools closed in 1996, but the effects on individuals, their families, and their communities are intergenerational and continue to this day, to the loss of our society as a whole, a loss which is incalculable. This is a chapter in our history of which I think a majority of Canadians remain almost entirely unaware. Universities have come to understand that we play a role in that ignorance and must play a role in its remediation. It's also our responsibility to help bring about reconciliation between Canadian society and its institutions and Aboriginal communities. Last November, UBC hosted a dialogue on the history of Indian residential schools in Canada. The two-day-long event was held in the First Nations House of Learning, a traditional longhouse situated on our Vancouver campus. University administrators, students, residential school survivors gathered in a circle to speak and to listen. Now, in the center of that circle sat a child's empty desk with a blanket laid over the back of the chair. The desk was there to represent the children's lives that were lost and those that were so profoundly damaged. As I looked at it, I suddenly understood that this simple school desk, which to me symbolizes education and all its opportunities, represented something utterly different to residential school survivors and to their children and their children's children. Many cultures place a high value on formal and particularly on Western education, and we see those cultures well represented on our campuses. But what about those cultures for whom education actually meant eradication, for whom pluralism meant assimilation, even annihilation? His Highness the Aga Khan cautions us that pluralism is difficult and that the choices it requires do not come naturally. In fact, for some, it represents an unimaginable risk with no reasonable expectation of reward. These times we live in demand that we do it anyway, all of us. Discomfort, distance, distrust, confusion, conflicts, misunderstandings, mistakes, and all. The question is, of course, how? To answer, a short story. A young violinist from Grande Prairie, Alberta, is the local prodigy and the pride of her hometown. She's mastered her Royal Conservatory training, taken first place in festivals across the country, and has just been invited to play as a guest with the Philharmonic Orchestra in one of the greatest concert halls in the country, on the continent. Thrilled, she flies to New York, checks into her hotel, and then instead of trying to hail a cab, because it's such a lovely evening, she decides to walk to the hall. Well, it's her first time in New York City, and after a few wrong turns, she's lost. What's worse, she's broken the heel of her shoe, it's starting to rain, she hasn't worn a coat, and there's no time to turn back, or she'll miss the orchestra warm-up. Embarrassed, she approaches a stranger on the street and says, "Excuse me, can you tell me how to get to Carnegie Hall?" The stranger looks at the limping young girl with wet hair and clothes and the violin case tucked under her arm and says, "Practice." I know it's a chestnut, but consider a little bit further. I'd guess that everyone here has heard someone play the violin, whether at a live concert or on a recording. But have you ever heard someone learning to play the violin? To get good at something, you must practice. And there are two prerequisites for practice: the desire to be good and the willingness to be bad. As in, learning to play the violin bad. To learn to do a thing with any degree of mastery requires, first of all, that you not be able to do that thing. Not knowing. I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't understand. How we hate that. But to learn to play the violin, or to learn to create harmony in a pluralistic world, we need to exercise muscles that we've never used. To listen more deeply, to be willing to be uncomfortable, sometimes deeply so, to be willing to be vulnerable in front of our teachers, our fellow practitioners, our friends, and our opponents. Earlier, I described a university as a safe place for significant conversations about sensitive issues among people of profound cultural difference. We must be a place where it's safe to be a beginner at this, where it's safe to practice, even for those who've earned the title master or doctor. Practice and pragmatism share similar etymological roots. Simply put, pragmatism is a philosophical approach that gauges the truth of a theory or belief in terms of how successful it is in practical application. In my role as an international lawyer, my colleagues and I have been investigating the use of a pragmatic approach in the creation of international law. The greatest challenge facing international law today is, I think, how to construct normative institutions while admitting and upholding the diversity of people in international society. The kind of lawmaking we're proposing, which I call transactional law, is the result of reciprocity between all participants, a collaboration to build shared understandings, and a commitment to uphold a practice of legality. It does not assume or even aspire to the creation of a shared global identity or a deep coalescence of values. What is key is that shared understandings that we are trying to build, I think, are only likely to arise from repeated social practice. At this, I have to mention an area where this is happening all day, every day, all over the world. Not only in matters of law, but in politics, the environment, community development, crisis relief, and of course, celebrity gossip, and its online social media. Facebook, just as one example, currently has over 800 million active members. That's almost 27 times the population of Canada. 350 million of them are accessing their accounts via mobile devices. More than 70 languages are used on the site, and the average number of connected people to others is 130 individuals and 80 groups. Communities are built on common interest, shared histories, need for information, the desire for connection, and a safe place to agree or disagree. For young people especially, this kind of daily practice with friends and strangers is now a matter of course. What we have the opportunity to do at a university is to help translate that habit into situations where the community of practice is even more diverse and far deeper, to apply knowledge and new research, and from there take it into settings where the stakes are much higher. Informally at UBC Vancouver, the Simon K.Y. Lee Global Lounge is a home base for globally focused student clubs. Over 1,000 students gather there for dialogue and action. They sponsor programs to foster international engagement and intercultural understanding, and they build community with staff and faculty interested in global issues. In the classroom, UBC's Department of Asian Studies is creating a Persian language program that will anchor a broader program in Persian and Iranian studies. Persian culture, Iranian cinema, headed by a research chair in Persian language and literary culture. Emmanuel Adler, a professor of international relations at the University of Toronto, calls these kinds of gatherings from informal to formal communities of practice. These communities create the social fabric of learning. They're made up of real people who, working through network channels across national borders, across organizational divides in the halls of government, affect political, economic, and social events, end quote. He suggests that we think about the world neither as an assemblage of states, nor as divided by borders and lines of national identification, but as transnational communities of practice, based on what people actually do rather than where they happen to live. According to Adler, and I agree, quote, "The ordinary unfolding of practice generates transformation. Transformation is the ordinary accomplishment of social life," end quote. Now, as I say that out loud, perhaps it sounds naive. Perhaps all of it does. The idea that a first-year university class, a hello between strangers, social media, the beginner mind, language, literature, a global lounge, might be in any way the substrate for the solutions that we seek to desperate poverty, economic crises, climate change, health epidemics, war, and terror. But if I look at the common denominator amongst all those things, what I find is hope. The hope of an individual that shall grow. The hope of helping or being helped. The hope of finding friendship. The hope inherent in starting at the very beginning of something, like the violin, like a Canada trying to include its First Nations, where everything that lies ahead is unknown and anything is possible. The alternatives, of course, are fear, perhaps despair, and I do believe that the course you follow is a matter of choice. From my efforts as part of the United Nations Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances, from my inquiry into Meher Arar's kidnapping and torture, and from having experienced tragedy in my own life, I know that we can always use what we see in front of us to justify despair. But the ability to envision something better can be learned too, can become a habit. Through casual conversation and formal dialogue, in the classroom and in community service, through hosting international scholars at home and creating opportunities for study and research abroad, universities invite their students, staff, faculty, and alumni, members of the broader community, to become global citizens. This is a designation that cannot be conferred by any country or institution, but only through participation and practice. We transform ourselves into citizens, and that transformation is sustained by a recognition that as moral beings, we are here to help one another. That we cannot set someone outside our circle. We cannot turn our back on someone less fortunate than ourselves without in some way compromising ourselves and our own humanity. I close today with the words of a young girl who was perhaps the quintessential global citizen. She did not attend university. She was never allowed the chance. Yet what she was able to accomplish in her lifetime and what has been accomplished since through her legacy can instruct all of us who may feel at times that we're lacking in choice or opportunity or freedom. Anne Frank wrote in her diary, and I quote, "Everyone has inside of him a piece of good news. The good news is that you don't know how great you can be, how much you can love, what you can accomplish and what your potential is. It's the task of our lives to find out and to help others to do the same. It's the task of our universities, along with our partners, to create together a global community of practice in which that may happen for our students, staff, scholars, and for all people we serve. The time for the best of deeds has come. Thank you.